As you know, Albert of Saxony's Logica has been composed at Paris between 1351 and 1362. A first version dates to the beginning of the period, a second version to the end of it, exactly to 1360. The work, namely Albert's Logica, is handed down to us in 47 manuscripts and fragments and an early print, Venice 1522. It comprises 6 treatises, the last of which has 2 parts, namely Insolubilia and Obligationes. These 2 partial treatises are also contained in 4 of the 5 early prints of Albert's Sophismata, and the Obligationes have been printed also alone at Lyon in circa 1493. Regarding the Insolubilia, I count 35 manuscripts and 5 early prints, which transmit these partial treatises. Please see also my edition, which appeared with Felix Meiner Verlag at Hamburg in 2010, and my recent paper in Kimagel 89, 2020, pages 51 to 100. It was my ambition to see and check all witnesses of the Logica Alberti, and it happened that the very last manuscript I inspected personally was a codex of the famous Biblioteca Ambrosiana at Milano, Vedilicet B36 Superior. And this manuscript offered a big surprise insofar as the 2 parts of the last treatise are completely different from the usual versions which are extant in so many manuscripts and early prints. The Ambrosiana manuscript gives a uniform impression. The preceding treatise 5 ends as usual and is explicitly ascribed to Albert, Explicitunt Fallatiae Alberti, in the last line of the relevant column. In the first line of the next column, the unique version of the Insolubilia begins, followed by a unique version of the Obligationes, and at the very end of the entire copy, it reads Explicit Logica Magistri Alberti de Saxonia, qui fuit regens Parisius. The Insolubilia themselves do not present an explicit description, but only have Expliciunt Insolubilia. On 2 additional leaves, it reads, among other inscriptions, Finito Libo Anno Domini 1408, which apparently means the date of the copy. The catalogue of Jordan and Wool gives Austria as possible provenance, but I can't see for which reason. Perhaps the reason is a certain Gallus de Ungaria among the previous possessors in 1415. There is indeed a Gallus de Ungaria documented at the universities of Prague and Vienna in 1382 and 1383, respectively, but that alone does not mean much for the history of our codex. Unfortunately, the text quality of this manuscript is not very high, so that a second witness of the unique parts would be most welcome. Up to now, however, I could not find any. Before discussing the pros and cons of regarding this text as a genuine work of Albert of Saxony, I shall first give an overview of its contents. For the sake of brevity, I shall use the terms usual version versus unique version and the name Albert Stroke for the author of the unique version. At the end, I shall argue that it is indeed very likely that Albert's stroke is identical with Albert of Saxony. As is well known, the usual version of Albert's Insolubilia starts with 3 sets of descriptiones, suppositiones, and conclusiones, and then goes on to discuss a lot of exempla, the first of which is the famous liar case. According to Albert, sentences of this kind signify both that they are true and that they are false. Therefore, they are false. From their being false, however, it does not follow that they are true, because they are not absolutely true, but only in a certain respect. Therefore, the paradox machine is stopped. See on all this, for instance, Stevens' paper, The Liar Paradox from John Buridan back to Thomas Bradwardine. The unique version has a completely different structure. De facto, the treatise consists of 6 chapters, although only chapters 2 through 5 are explicitly called so in the manuscript. The first chapter presents 5 previous opinions, which is quite a usual start of treatises on insolubles, as in Thomas Bradwardine, William Heytesbury, and many others. But it is completely lacking in Albert's usual version. Then follow 4 chapters on 4 species of insolubles. Vidilacid first, insolubles which arise from new imposition of terms. Second, insolubles which arise from our internal acts. Third, insolubles which arise from our external acts. And fourth, insolubles which arise from all 3 previous sources together. And finally, there is a chapter on apparent insolubles, quae apparent insolubilia et non sunt. This structure has striking similarities to Roger Swinehead's treatise, apart from the fact that Roger does not have any survey of previous opinions. Surprisingly enough, however, this structure announced at the end of the survey of previous opinions, and again at the beginning of the 4 chapters on different species of insolubles, does not correspond to the actual process of the work, as we shall see. Let us turn now to the 5 previous opinions in the first chapter of that unique treatise. The first opinion states that every sentence from which it can be inferred that it is false, and it accepts 2 theses. Vidilacid first, that of 2 contradictory sentences, both can be false together. And second, that there can be a sound and formal consequence, having a true antecedent and a false consequent. Albert's stroke then gives 2 arguments on which those theses are based and criticizes both of them, so that he finally rejects this first opinion, except for its statement that every sentence which implies its falsehood is false. This first opinion apparently is that of Roger Swinehead, whose Insolubilia antedate Heytesbury's regulae of 1335 by a few years. See Spade's catalogue under item 63 and his edition of 1979. The second opinion is most interesting insofar as Albert Stroke repeatedly calls it the most rational of all the 5, and it is just the view advocated by Albert of Saxony in the usual version. In the unique version, however, it is presented as only probable and plausible in comparison with the other opinions, whereas in the usual version, it is presented without any hesitation as the true theory. This second view presupposes that every sentence signifies that it is true. Therefore, if any sentence signifies that it is false, because it is impossible that any sentence is true and false at once. This view accepts that there can be two completely similar sentences, idealized sentences having the same subject and the same predicate, as well as the same quality and the same quantity, but nevertheless the one being true and the other being false. Take, for instance, two tokens of the sentence A est falsum and call the first A and the second B. Then the first will be false, since it falsifies itself, because it itself is A. The second one, however, will be true, because it precisely signifies that A is false, and so it is the case, and consequently B is true. Against this view, 4 objections are made and solved by Albert Strode, and that in the form of tunc attrationes, as we know it in the genre of questions. The third opinion, satis concordat, with the second view, as Albert Strode puts it. The special point of this view is that no insoluble case is to be admitted in which it is assumed that the insoluble sentence signifies something in a precise manner, tr.VI in Latin. Because if such a case would be admitted, it would follow that two contradictory sentences are true or false at once. If the insoluble case does not specify the signification of the insoluble sentence as precise or not, the case has to be admitted and the sentence has to be doubted. The assumption that the respondent has to ask about the signification of the sentences involved is rejected by Albert Strode. That this is not needed is again an advantage of the second view, which takes the terms and sentences according to their primary significations and the truth values accordingly. This third opinion seems to be Heytesbury's position, which later on was also advocated by John of Holland. The fourth opinion, unfortunately, is mutilated in the manuscript. The relevant passage comprises only 6 lines of the column. Presumably, this defect is due to a line skip. What is clear anyway is that this view accepts insoluble sentences as genuine sentences having a predicate and a copula and signifying that it is the case somehow, ali qualita esse. And by such a sentence, a man can grasp that it is the case somehow. The further explanations and the objections are missing, however, and only the end of this passage is left, ideo ista opinio non valid. In view of the following item, this opinion could have been the one which accepts insolubles as sentences, but denies that they are absolutely true or false. Instead, insolubles are only true or false secundum quid, that is, conditionally true or false according to the relevant Aristotelian concepts. But the mutilated text itself does not present any grounds for this conjecture. Perhaps Barbara and Stephen have found some traces of this opinion, which accepts insolubles as true sentences having a predicate and a copula and signifying alli qualita esse. I don't know any other source for this fourth opinion. The fifth and last view states that insoluble sentences are genuine sentences and therefore are true or false, but no insoluble sentence is true and none is false either. This view is also discussed and rejected by William Heytesbury and others. Cajetan of Thiene, in his commentary on Heytesbury from the early 15th century, attributes this view to Kilvington, but according to Spade, this is at best a distortion of Kilvington's view. Albert Stroke also rejects this view, introducing his criticism with the words sed videtur absurdum. Concluding this part and preparing the next one, Albert Stroke states again that the second view appears to be superior to the others, and that he will therefore proceed according to this view. In the matter of insolubles, there are four sources from which the difficulties arise. First, from new imposition of terms. Second, from our interior acts, such as knowing, doubting, etc. Third, from our exterior acts, such as uttering or saying. And fourth, from all those three together. Accordingly, the following part of the treatise is divided into 4 chapters, quote, Ideo iste tractatus habebit per ordinem quartor capitula, which is a bit strange because we would rather count the entire piece as one treatise having 6 chapters in all. But this is only a superficial feature of the work. The first chapter on new impositions in its turn is divided into 5 principal parts, namely concerning categorical sentences on the one hand and hypothetical sentences on the other, the latter being divided into conjunctive, disjunctive, exclusive, and exceptive sentences. The first insoluble discussed is E est falsum, and all in all, this chapter comprises 10 insolubles. At the end of the first part of this chapter 1, some suppositions are introduced, again according to the second opinion, quae apparet magis vera, as Albert Stroke puts it. First, every sentence from which it can be inferred that it is false. And the foundation for this already had been stated, vide licet, every sentence of the world signifies that it is true. The same wording occurs as third conclusion in Albert of Saxony's usual version. Second, it is possible that there are 2 sentences completely similar, but that one of them is true and the other false. For instance, the sentence "Sor dicit falsum," uttered by Socrates and uttered by Plato, respectively. Third, under special conditions, it can be the case that the consequence is not valid, which has completely similar sentences as antecedent and consequent respectively. Usually, a consequence of the form, if P then P, is perfectly valid, although not informative. But if P is replaced with an insoluble sentence, this does not hold any longer, because the truth values may be different, as stated in the second supposition. Fourth, the contradiction of an insoluble sentence cannot be a merely categorical sentence, but must be a hypothetical one. For this, compare also conclusion 7 in Albert of Saxony. The point is that insoluble sentences can have a categorical surface structure, but a hypothetically deep structure. For instance, as Albert of Saxony has it, ego dico falsum means ego dico verum et ego dico falsum. Therefore, the contradiction has to be ego non dico verum vel ego non dico falsum, according to the Morgan school, which has been well known in the Middle Ages. The first chapter on insolubles arising from impositions and the second chapter on insolubles arising from interior acts do correspond to the structure announced before. But, surprisingly enough, this is not true of chapters 3 and 4, quote, in hoc tertio capitulo videndum est consequenta de insolubilibus, quorum difficultas provenit ex istis actibus, sicut sunt intelligere, syllogizare, apparare, etc. The first example is sor intelligits falsum. These are clearly interior acts, but according to the previous announcements, the chapter should have been about exterior acts. And the fourth chapter should have been about a mixture of all sources, videlicet imposition, interior acts, and exterior acts, but no talk at all about that. Instead, it reads at the beginning, quote, nunc consequenta in hoc quarto capitulo videndum est de insolubilibus, quorum difficultas est ex credulitate propositionis. Et primo bonato hoc insolubile, sua credit aliter quam est. But of course, credere is again an interior act and not an exterior act or a mixture of all acts together. So, the original plan of the work has not been carried out in full. With a wink, we should see this as an additional reason for counting this unique version as a true work of Albert of Saxony. Concerning the last chapter on apparent insolubles, Albert Strode does not give a definition of apparent insoluble, as Schweinshead does not either, but he confines himself to discussing 4 examples. Because at the beginning of his answers to the cases it reads, ad ista insolubilia et consimilia faciliter respondetur, we may conclude that the criterion of distinguishing true and apparent insolubles is the difficulty or facility of solving them, which interpretation corresponds to the explication of the concept of insolubles at the beginning of the treatise. Let us turn now to the pros and cons for counting this treatise as a genuine work of Albert of Saxony. First, as already has been said, the treatise is an organic part of a true witness of the entire Logica Alberti. Second, the extended incipit of the unique version has at the end the following sentence. Et non est intelligendum, quod dicatur insolubile ex eo, quod nullo modo possit solvi, sed quia cum difficultate solvitur. The same explication of the term insoluble occurs in the incipit of the usual version of Albert of Saxony. Quote, nunc restat solvere insolubilia, et dicuntur insolubilia non quia nullo modo possint solvi, sed quia solvere est difficile. The source for this seems to be a nice passage at the beginning of a treatise from the mid-13th century, edited by Marie-Louise Roux in 1970, item 6 in Spade's catalogue, in which passage 3 senses of the term insolubile are distinguished. Quote, uno modo quod nullo modo potest solvi, alio modo quod bene potest solvi quantum est de se, propter tamen aliquod impedimentum nunquam solvitur. Tertio modo quod propter sui difficultatem difficile solvitur. So it is in Albert of Saxony and as well in Albert Strode in the unique treatise, the third meaning of insolubile as in the treatise edited by Roux. It is on page 248 in Roux's edition. Of course, this point is not decisive, but it neatly fits the other points. Third, the assumption that every sentence signifies its own truth, which is central in both the usual and the unique versions. And in general, the entire theory built around this center, apart from the fact that in the unique version it is presented as merely probable, whereas in the usual version it is presented as definitely true. Fourth, the view of the contradiction of liar sentences and similar cases is common to both versions, the unique one and the usual one. And fifth, the view that not every consequence is valid which has two sentence tokens of the same type as antecedent and consequent is again common to both versions. It is based on the assumption that tokens of this kind can have different truth values. A still closer comparison of the two versions presumably will reveal even more such correspondences. And what about the cons? I do not see a single one for the time being. Of course, it may be asked why busy Albert should have composed two different versions of treatise 6 of his Logica. But this is no point at all. First, because the entire Logica Alberti seems to have been work in progress from the beginning to the end of his sojourn at Paris. And second, because there are also other examples of different versions of works of Albert's, for instance, most famous, his Questiones Posteriorum, which has two very different versions. So, if this is really an unknown genuine work of Albert of Saxony, it seems to be an early one, because the usual version is more systematically arranged and presented in a decisive manner, whereas the unique version has some reservations in content and even some incoherences in structure, as we have seen before. It seems to be in an unfinished state and to have been abandoned soon, being replaced with the usual version. Thank you. I can send you the text of my talk so that you can read it and perhaps understand it better than in my English. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harald, for this very interesting talk. As before, now the floor is open for questions. So anyone who wants to raise a question, please use the chat box with your name, and we will unmute you.
Thank you.
Okay, I do have a question myself in case no people are queuing. So, do you think that this difference might also originate from different teaching activities, as we have seen, for example, in the case of Paul of Venice? Although the result is the same, then the way of explaining is perhaps different, or perhaps is this kind of reportatio or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. This would be a very plausible explanation for the existence of two different versions. That it is Albert made it in different courses on logic. Yes, thank you. It's the best explanation, perhaps. And there are also other examples. For instance, his logic, he has offered at least twice in teaching. The entire Logica of Albert of Saxony was at least twice the basis of two lectures of Albert at Paris. So it could be the case that even these parts were presented in different lectures. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Graziana. Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions of clarification. What's the relative dating? What's your opinion about the relative dating of the two texts? Which one is earlier? Which one is later?
So the manuscript itself seems to be rather late. It's from the beginning of the 15th century, and we have many manuscripts which are quite older than that. But the unique version seems to be, if it is a genuine version, very early, as I have tried to make plausible, whereas the usual version occurs in both different versions of the entire Logica of Albert of Saxony. The second version can be dated exactly 1360, as I said. The first version must have been composed not before 1351, when Albert became a master at Paris, and not after 1356, because this is the earliest dated manuscript we know. And if I'm right, and this is a genuine work of Albert of Saxony, it must even earlier than the first redaction of the known entire Logica. So at the very beginning of the 1350s, I think. But it is surprising that only a quite late manuscript does transmit a single copy of this unique version. So maybe this is a reason for doubting the authenticity of the work, maybe.
Now, this is very interesting because I'm thinking of Marsilius' treatise on Insolubilia, which doesn't really circulate that much. We don't have many complete copies, only 3. But in principle, Marsilius is following at least the broad structure of Albert's usual version. So you have the opening with the definitions of the terms, the suppositions. It follows usual structure, and he seems to have that version in mind very, very solidly. But then there is always a section where he addresses the problem of what is an insoluble and the definitions, And he goes into the three ways in which we speak of an insoluble. And between that section in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he seems to really take a point in arguing that those three versions should be reframed in terms of putting an emphasis on the fact that insolubles in a proper sense are self-refuting. So he seems to be arguing with something that Albert is doing, well, according to Marsilius, not in a proper sense, in the unique version, because he's saying, no, you can solve some. There are, of course, you can solve some insolubles, but that's not a really proper way of speaking. Like, what you want to speak properly of an insoluble is of some sentence that is self-reflexive and denies itself. So, but he still does that in the framework of the three modes in which we speak of insolubles, so the three senses of insolubles. And that's not that common at that point, is it? It's not a very common way of putting it down from the 50s onwards, right? Am I wrong? I'm not an expert on the literature on that period.
Yeah. Maybe. May I ask you, does Marsilius have a survey of previous opinions in his treatise?
Yes, but they're not exactly the same as the ones that Albert is surveying. They're slightly different. Mm-hmm. But yes, he has 4 opinions, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm not familiar with Marsilius' treatise, so I'm very eager to hear your talk and to read your paper on it.
But I was wondering if Marsilius could have had access to this early version in some way of Albert's treatise, if you could have seen this unique version by Albert Strode.
Mm-hmm. So I think it must have been available at Paris if it is really a genuine work, but it is not transmitted in much copies, it seems. But if it was composed at Paris and it is a genuine work by Albert, it must have been available at Paris, of course, and still available to Marsilius in the 60s, I think.
But we'll talk about that tomorrow. I think Marsilius.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You're muted, Barbara, I think.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to disturb anyone. The next question is from Stephen.
Yes. Thank you, Harald, very much. That's very exciting. I mean, as you will have gathered from my own talk and from other things I've said, I'm very interested to find out what these connections are between Oxford and Paris. And if this is really by Albert, then it really is the first time I've seen such a clear connection between what was happening in Oxford and what subsequently then happens in Paris, because these are clearly Oxford views that are being rejected in a way that I haven't seen before from anyone from Paris. One of the puzzles about Albert is that although he only arrives in Paris in 1351, he's clearly been somewhere else before.
Yes.
Given his knowledge. I don't know I don't know what the latest scholarship is on that. I haven't myself heard any. I mean, there was speculation years ago he was in Prague.
No, this Prague view can be rejected in my view. Albert has been actually at Prague, but only after his Paris career. Before his years at Paris, the most probable place is Erfurt. I suppose that he has been at Erfurt before he went to Paris. And maybe he could have been at Magdeburg. And this is very interesting because at Magdeburg in 1341, a very famous manuscript of Ockham's Logic was copied. So maybe Albert had at Magdeburg early access to Ockham's Logic.
That's very interesting, but hopefully he had access to more than Ockham's treatise of Insolubles. You'll remember, others may not have seen this, that Ockham says something in his very brief treatment of Insolubles. I only put this in because I had to, and I'm not really interested in it. I do paraphrase a bit, but it's a very dismissive remark about the Insolubles in the Summa Logicae. But I wondered if there was any possibility that the work you're referring to was composed before he arrived in Paris.
It is a very interesting point you make. Yes, it could be. And that he at Paris learned much more material, came to know much more material, and abandoned his previous theory. Yeah, it could be.
Because the other brief comment, I know we will end soon, is the other speculation about Albert years ago was that he was connected with Bradwardine, which has been largely dismissed for a number of reasons. What I don't understand myself, but the arguments largely against it, is that Albert and Marsilius and others are in the English nation at Paris, and Bradwardine is in the Picardy nation at Paris. Yeah. Now, I'm not quite sure how hard and fast those divisions held, because it must have been quite easy to hear what people were doing in other lecture theatres in Paris. Yeah. But on the other hand, one would expect the English nation to have some contact with what was happening in Oxford, perhaps better contact than the people in the Picardy nation. So yeah. Albert would seem a very natural bridge from the Oxford tradition into Paris, coming with his knowledge of Swineshead and Heytesbury, and maybe modified Heytesbury, and then discovering Bradwardine's views when he's in Paris, or at least Bradwardine's old views, and then Bradwardine changing his mind, possibly under the influence of Albert. There's a very interesting history to be told here.
Yeah. I agree with you, but we have no data to support this view. But he seems to have an exquisite knowledge of Oxford literature, Albert, yeah?
Yeah.
Perhaps at Paris, the best professor who received English and Oxford literature, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other question or?
Okay.
Okay, in case.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Hello, Alfred.
Hello, Harold. Thank you for your talk. Your English was good enough for me, by the way, but still I would like to get your written version. I wondered, you mentioned that this is a unique version of this text.
Yeah.
it looks quite different from all the other usual versions. But you mentioned 5 points on which this text is compatible with the other text by Albert on the same subject. Did you also find some incompatibilities between this version and the other versions? For example, you mentioned he had, I think, about 33 examples. Are these the same examples he uses in the other versions, or are they quite other than what he brings forth in the other versions?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have not found a single incompatibility between the two versions, but many similarities. So it is quite plausible that both versions are by the same author. And your question is interesting. The examples are rarely the same in both versions.
Oh.
I shall make lists of the examples, but there are only very few which are common to the unique and the usual version. It's an interesting point, yeah. But I have not found a single point, systematically point, which would be a contradiction between the both versions.
Okay.
It seems more to be a development from an early to a later extended version.
Okay, thank you.
And even if there were a contradicting position, it would not mean necessarily that the author is not the same. We know from Albert that he changed in some points his mind. And for instance, in Suppositio Confusa Tantum, he has completely changed his mind. And there are inconsistencies in the manuscript tradition of the Logica on this ground.
Yeah. And in this manuscript which you used,
yes, there are
parts from the Logica, I think.
Yeah. I have developed the point in my Kimagel paper recently published in the Cahiers de l'Institut du Moyen Âge grec et latin, and so on. It is surprising that there is really an inconsistency between some manuscripts of the Logic of Albert. So apparently he has changed completely his mind regarding a special sort of supposition. But it is not the case with the unique version of the Insolubilia and the common version. I have not found a single point which would be not compatible with each other.
Yeah, but what I meant was this chapter on Insolubilia is part of a larger manuscript containing the rest of the Logica.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And in the rest of the manuscript, there are no differences with other versions of the Logica, with the usual versions.
At least I have not found one. I have not a complete reproduction of the Milano manuscript, but I have seen it personally and checked some passages. But I have a reproduction of the unique last treatise number 6. I do have it.
Yeah. But it seems like the only point on which it is different from other versions is this chapter 6.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting points, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.